All right, we're going to go down to the ACT now. And I'm going to say a lot of things about the ACT. They're going to contradict what most of you have heard or think about it. And this is one area where there are few people in the world who know this test better than me. I eat, breathe, and live this test, and it's really all that I've done for most of my hours for the last 9 years of my life. So, but even so, I'm not asking you to take my word for anything I'm about to say. You can test everything yourself. I just can't encourage you enough to know that so much of the information out there about the ACT is just plain wrong. And we have data to back up everything I'm going to say here. So you're welcome to challenge me on any of it during the question and answer section. And I'm open to being wrong. If the data shows something that I'm not considering, then, I'll change my mind. But this is what I have been persuaded of that most parents and students and schools have wrong about the ACT when they call us. So, and I've narrowed it down. I can obviously talk about this topic forever, but these are the things that are most consequential as far as parents and students go. So one of the big questions that we get asked a lot are when to take the ACT. And I'm just going to answer it first, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm answering that way. The easy answer to this is as soon as you can after your student has taken Algebra 2 and Geometry. So as soon as you can. When should you take it and start prepping? You should take it and start prepping as soon as you can after the completion of Algebra 2 and Geometry. So I've been telling families for a long time that the ACT is a middle school test. Everything a student needs to score a 28 or above on English, reading, and science has been taught by the end of 8th grade. A large portion of the math section is over pre-algebra and Algebra 1. Most smart students have taken those by the end of 8th grade. There are only 4 questions per test on the science section that require outside science knowledge. Everything else is testing a student's ability to read charts and graphs and think scientifically. There are tons of parents who wait until students complete trigonometry and calculus before taking the ACT, but there are only 4 trig questions and no true calculus questions on the ACT. There's sometimes one question that looks like a calculus question, but can be taught to an 8th grader. And most of the trig questions can be taught to an 8th grader without any experience with trigonometry or pre-calc. Therefore, we have found that most students' math scores will actually start to come down the longer they wait after Algebra 2 and Geometry. In the last 6 months, just to prove the point, we have had a 9th grader in our program score 33 on the ACT, a 9th grader, a 10th grader who scored a perfect 36 on their ACT. Neither of these students were geniuses. So how is it possible for a 9th grader to score a 33 if the test is mainly covering material taught in high school? We also have a 7th grader who's starting our program this month, and she scored a 26 on her pre-class ACT with no prep, hitting a 28 on English and a 30 on reading. AP and IB classes, like I said a second ago, certainly have a positive impact on ACT scores, as do Algebra 2 and Geometry. But outside of those, we do not see a ton of movement beyond around 2 to 3 points from a student's freshman to their junior year. So we can't emphasize enough to not necessarily plan on doing the school's model of waiting until the spring of your junior year, which is a very common ACT date that all of the juniors take the ACT. And I mean, we would probably say go ahead and take it your freshman year just to see where you're at. A student can take it as soon as they're 13. And, we would recommend just going ahead and taking it and seeing where you're at, and then prepping as soon as you can after the close or, nearing the completion of Algebra 2 and geometry, which for many students is going to be closer to the end of their sophomore year, which is probably ideal. Summer after their sophomore year is probably an ideal time to prep and maybe even be completely done with the ACT by December of their junior year, which is before many students have even taken their ACT for the first time. So just something to consider. Doesn't mean we're right about it, but something to consider. Next question that we get a lot is, what is a good ACT score? This is a hairy topic, so I'm not going to spend much time on it other than to say that it is our experience that the vast majority of students with at least a 3.5 GPA are capable of at least a 28 on the ACT. We will also say that the average ACT score for an incoming freshman at UT is typically around a 28 or a 29. So even though the national average is around a 21, this is not a good metric to use to determine whether or not your student is where they need to be to achieve their goals. And it really is all dependent on your goals. If your student has below a 3.5 GPA and they're planning on going to UT, probably a 24, 25, 26 is going to get you accepted. We have students regular with a 3.1 GPA who get accepted at UT with a 25 on their ACT. So it all is dependent on your goals. But if you're trying to compare yourself to the average of the schools you're wanting to go to, like UT, the average incoming freshman at UT is going to be around a 28 or 29. So we would say, the 28 is really if you have a smart student, that should be the expectation that you set it in the home if scholarship dollars are an important part of you. I will also say that the minimum ACT for merit-based scholarship money at UT is a 28. So we told you before that, if you're trying for the volunteer, they now have an option where you don't have to submit an ACT score, but for the guaranteed scholarship and what it has been for many, many years, it fluctuates between a 28 and a 29, but right now, it was a 28 and a 3.8 GPA to get the first level of the volunteer scholarship at UT. And we had mentioned the second level of the Hope Scholarship called the GAMS. And to get that, you need a 29 ACT score. And the GAMS is awesome. And so few parents know about it who call us. But if you have a 3.75 GPA and a 29 on your ACT, any school that you go to in Tennessee, you have this guaranteed additional money on top of the Hope. It's going to be $1,000 to $1,500 per year, depending on if you're taking summer classes and some other factors. But it's guaranteed money, any school you choose in Tennessee. So if you're wanting to have, a bar, but the beautiful thing, once you get to that 28, everything above that 28 is money at many, many schools. It's like just increasing the money. And you'll see that on the It Pays to Prep scholarship guide that we showed you not too long ago. Another point that is important to make right here is that a bad ACT score says nothing about your student's potential, nothing. And, so many students feel stupid because they have a bad ACT score, but the reality is it's not measuring your intelligence, and so, but on the flip side of that, we will say that a good ACT score says a lot. And that is why, it's important to take into consideration. So bad ACT score doesn't say anything about your potential, but a good ACT score says a lot. And one other thing we'll say on this topic is that a lot of parents get upset with their school for the student not doing well. But as we said before, there is little to no correlation between a high GPA and high ACT scores. The single best predictor that we have noticed of how well a student does on the ACT is a student's reading speed and how many fiction novels they have read for fun in their lives. And we'll come back to reading here when we get to the prepping portion of our session. But if your student has a great GPA, we see a very common, and they score bad on the ACT. It is so common that they haven't read a ton of books in their lifetime. They're not big readers. And we'll just say right now that, if a student reads twice as fast as you, even though this student might know the content more, the student who reads twice as fast is almost certainly going to do better on the test, because the student who knows the content better can't finish the test if they can't read and comprehend fast enough. And we're going to come back to that later, but just, something before you start getting upset with your schools for, maybe not having high ACT scores, just something to take into consideration. All right, next thing is the myths about harder to get high scores. And for your students' sake, please do not buy into the myth that it is harder to get to a higher score. We have parents call us all the time who say things like, my student has a 28 in so-and-so subject, so I think we should focus on the other sections. The reality is that the hard part of the ACT is teaching students the content. Once a student is at a 28, they're getting pretty close to having most of the content down. Then it is more a matter of tying off loose ends and getting their timing down. Those points between a 28 and a 34 on English and reading, are some of the easiest points for a student to win if they just know how to train for them properly. The science can be a bit harder, and the math takes a lot more work because, it really is still a matter of content, no matter what level. But on the math, the scores will continue to go up. All the way until they're getting incredible scores, as long as they keep learning more of the content being tested. Just something, if your student has a higher section of the ACT score that is so often, misconstrued when parents call us, that's probably the easiest points that they're going to get, especially on the English and the reading, to go from that 28 up to the higher numbers. We had the question about taking the ACT multiple times, and we're going to address that now. Families are sometimes worried about taking the ACT multiple times because they're worried that schools will see those scores. The reality is that there are almost no schools in the nation that require students to send all ACT scores, which is not true of the SAT. Of the 10 or so schools that I'm aware of that require all ACT scores be sent, more than half of them simply superscore those test scores anyways. And in the worst case scenario that your student becomes determined to go to one of the handful of schools that it will actually negatively impact them to have taken a test their freshman year that was bad or whatever, you can actually delete out those scores from the ACT. It takes a little bit of work, but it's just filling out a form with the ACT. They'll delete it and it's gone. So the benefit of your student taking the ACT multiple times far outweighs any cons of doing so. A student can take it up to 12 times. And a student, schools are not, sometimes parents are worried that schools are going to see it as weird that they took it a bunch of times. It would be weird if a student didn't take it a bunch of times. The school really just wants to look good themselves. And that is what higher ACT scores are helping them do. So it's in their best interest as well to take your students' highest scores when they are considering them. And the last, part that we're going to talk about on this section is the super scoring. Most of you know about super scoring, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But for any of you who are new to the process, super scoring is where a school will accept your best score from each of the different sections across multiple tests on the ACT, which is another reason it's a big benefit to take the test multiple times, because maybe one of those tests has one section that lines up more with your student strengths on that section than another test. And so that can be advantageous. And the ACT just recently, this past week or so, made it so that they automatically create a super score for students that can be sent to schools who accept super scores. So probably more schools are even going to go to a super score model, where almost all of them, that are going to be popular around here already do super score. There's a handful. Auburn and Alabama don't, or at least they didn't pre-COVID. So that's one of the popular ones around here that doesn't super score. And there's some others. I think Vanderbilt doesn't, but for the most part, most schools are going to super score.